Welcome to Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis, the podcast where policymakers, legislators, thought leaders, licensees, and advocates come to discuss the evolving landscape of cannabis in New York and beyond. I'm Herb Barbot, former Director of Operations in New York's Office of Cannabis Management. Each episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with key voices shaping policy, business, and advocacy, plus expert insights on the latest developments impacting the industry. And now for the episode. Welcome to episode 10 of season 2 of Joint Session. We've now hit the double digits. This is Herb Barbot, and in this episode, we'll speak with Professor Rob Mejia from Stockton University in New Jersey, where he teaches cannabis studies. He's also the author of a new book called Cannabis Careers, The Insider's Guide to a Budding Industry. Before we hear from Professor Mejia, let's take a spin around this week's news. First, an update. Last week I mentioned an item involving the acting U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., Edward R. Martin, Jr., warning a licensed cannabis shop of its proximity to a school. Your dispensary appears to be operating in violation of federal law, and the Department of Justice has the authority to enforce federal law, even when such activities may be permitted under state or local law, Martin wrote. Persons and entities owning, operating, or facilitating such dispensaries may be subject to criminal prosecution and civil enforcement actions under federal law. Well, they may be subject to criminal prosecution, but it won't be Martin prosecuting. This week, President Trump was forced to withdraw Martin's nomination as Republican senators made it clear that Martin did not have the votes to be confirmed. In Connecticut, Attorney General William Tong announced last week a $4.93 million penalty imposed on an unlicensed cannabis shop called Planet Zaza that continued to sell cannabis after a court order in November to stop. The state of Connecticut is not playing around. Legal cannabis is not a free-for-all. If you are unlicensed, if you sell untested, unregulated products, we will find you and we will hold you accountable, Tong said in his announcement. The fines represent $5,000 for each of the 621 days they willfully violated the law, and $25,000 for each of the 73 days a defendants violated the court's temporary injunction. By the way, the Connecticut law has recently been amended to increase the fine for selling cannabis without a license to $30,000 a day. The Minnesota Office of Cannabis Management announced last week that June 5th will mark its first adult-use license lotteries. One lottery, open to all applicants, will be for cultivator, manufacturer, and mezzo business licenses. And it is mezzo business, kind of a micro business on steroids. Look it up. Another lottery, also on June 5th, but open only to social equity applicants, will take place for retail licenses. A lottery open to all applicants for retail licenses will take place sometime this summer. The office has prioritized the review of applications for the license types necessary to successfully stage the market, said OCM Interim Director Eric Taubel in the announcement. Governor Tim Walz signed adult use into law in 2023. Last Wednesday, the Pennsylvania House passed the cannabis legalization bill, marking the first time an adult use measure has passed the chamber in the state. The bill, HB 1200, now heads to the Senate. What makes this bill unique, maybe even odd, is that it envisions state-run shops, which no other state has yet attempted with adult use cannabis. Otherwise, the bill's provisions are similar to adult use legislation passed in other states and include provisions for automatic expungement, reinvesting tax revenue into communities harmed by prohibition, home cultivation, albeit with a permit, among others. However, passage of HB 1200 or other bills introduced in Pennsylvania remains uncertain. Republican State Senator Dan Laughlin wrote, "I have repeatedly made it clear that there is zero chance that the state store model will make it through the Senate. That idea is DOA." For the record, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro supports adult use legalization. The final item coincidentally relates to a conversation I was having with a friend who texted to tell me that he was speaking to his daughter about probable cause if a vehicle smells like pot. She told him she learned on this very podcast that the smell of cannabis alone does not give an officer probable cause. How cool is that? Anyway, as I explained to him, a major issue in the traffic safety space is that there is no legally accepted standard for determining impairment as there is with blood alcohol content. This week, researchers highlighted the importance of a standard THC unit to understand impaired driving. Back in 2021, the National Institute on Drug Abuse announced that a standard THC unit would be 5 milligrams, marking the first federal definition of a cannabis dose for researchers. Now, an article from Australian researchers in the May issue of the International Journal of Drug Policy explores the significance of that standard for understanding impaired driving in particular. As they wrote, today there is no agreed-upon definition of cannabis-impaired driving or agreed-upon method for measuring it. More specifically, the authors point out that this standard allows for researchers to create a new evidence base that is more robust than previous research that did not use this standard. Building new evidence that links the standard THC unit to driving behavior has the potential to create a new knowledge base to ensure that the reported safety-relevant effects are clear and concise, easily understood across different fields, and relevant to a broad range of end users, including consumers and those involved in shaping road safety policy and law enforcement. Please do not drink and drive or consume and drive. Thanks to Cannabis Wire for that news. Check out Cannabis Wire at cannabiswire.com. Robert Mejia is an award-winning adjunct professor at Stockton University in New Jersey. Through his work, he has helped shape cannabis curricula and foster industry connections for students. Beyond academia, Rob is the president of our Community Harvest, a cannabis education company which develops cannabis learning materials, including online courses. He is a sought-after speaker and has published works including the Essential Cannabis Book, a field guide for the curious, and has a brand new book coming out in April, which brings him to joint session today, Cannabis Careers, an Insider's Guide to a Budding Industry. Welcome, Professor Mejia.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
All right, so you got a sweet little gig here, teaching cannabis courses. So how did you come to teach at Stockton University?
Well, the way that I got to teach at Stockton University is kind of an interesting story. It started with my youngest son, who was visiting some state colleges, and he had Stockton on the list. So I went down there with him. But before that, I had read that Stockton actually had a couple cannabis courses that were being taught there. And so I made an appointment with one of their cannabis professors, Thomas Olah, who was teaching Introduction to Medical Cannabis. And when I went there, I brought my newly published Essential Cannabis book with me. Tom Olah and I spoke for 2 hours. My son had to come and get me. We developed such a close and great relationship that he asked me to speak in his class, which I was happy to do.
And what was this?
This was back in 2018. And for my first presentation, I'll say, our speech in his class, I actually gave a cooking with cannabis demonstration to the students, and they loved it. So I did that. And then also he had read my book, and they had a career fair shortly thereafter, which I attended as one of the potential employers. I did hire one of their students as an intern who helped me create a website for a project I was working on. And from there, the head of the department, Dr. Ekaterina Sadia, asked me if I wanted to teach the preparation for cannabis internship class because she knew I had a background in academia, background in publishing, curriculum creation, and I couldn't say yes quickly enough. And once I did that, I really jumped into the position and I started doing all kinds of things because people didn't tell me no. So I helped to run the next career fairs. I started to get students internships. I also created a couple new courses. I was involved in the cannabis club on campus. So I really embraced the opportunity and I still do today.
Did your son end up attending Stockton University?
He did not. And I think it's probably for the best. It would have been kind of interesting to see each other on campus. and he needed his own space. So he actually ended up in the middle of West Virginia, of all places. So no, he did not go to Stockton.
So we're here to talk about cannabis careers, workforce development. So can you just start off talking about what kind of careers are available in cannabis and also the distinction between plant touching and non-plant touching opportunities?
Sure. It's actually kind of a lot to cover, but with the students that I work with, they often start at entry-level positions. So they might minor in cannabis studies. We actually now have a major too, which we can talk about in a moment. But at any rate, I would say that a large number of the students start in entry-level cultivation positions. They start in lab positions, and then they also end up working at dispensaries, often starting as bud tenders. But the good news is that they are sharp and that they do have a background or in cannabis and a good baseline of knowledge, and so they get promotions quickly. So even if they start there, I see my students within 3 months, 6 months, maybe even a year at the most, that now they're becoming shift leaders. They're involved in inventory. They're involved in compliance. They start to work up the ladder in cultivation. So the opportunities really come to them in part because it's such a rapidly growing industry. And those are examples of kind of the plant touching. But the important thing that a lot of people don't realize is that well over 50% of all cannabis jobs are professional jobs, and they are often either called ancillary or support jobs. So those are things like consultants, attorneys, they can be application writers, they can be website creators, and then they can come from construction even. So they can be HVAC providers, they can be security camera installers. The list just goes on and on. There are actually more ancillary support jobs than there are full-time cannabis jobs. So I'll give you a couple quick stats for New York, since you're in New York. At the end of 2023, the New York cannabis market supported roughly 4,300 full-time jobs. In 1 year, going from 2023 to 2024 at the end, they were right at about 8,000 full-time jobs. The prediction is end of 2025, they will be at about 13,000 jobs. So you can see it is one of the fastest growing industries in the state, and that's the case in New Jersey as well. And it's actually even estimated that your dispensaries will do about $2.8 billion in 2025, which would probably make them, we'll see how things shake out, but probably the third largest market. You have California that would be up at about $7 billion, although they're having some big tax issues right now, which might really further hamper their business, but they're predicted about $7 billion. And then you have Florida. If Florida does pass adult use, they could bump up to about $3.2 billion. And then again, New York is about 2.8. Illinois would be next at about 2.5, Michigan about 2.3. So I hope that gives you a little perspective on kind of what the landscape is in the New York cannabis industry, and then also compared to other states who've been up and running longer than you have. But New York has population, you have farmland, you actually have quite a number of different licenses that are not available in other states that I think is really going to make your market one of the most remarkable in the world.
And that's the hope, obviously. Now, are there any specific skills or certifications, right? I mean, not everybody's going to go to college. Are there any certifications that are available, some particular training that folks should be looking at?
There is. It's kind of interesting because you do have some people who come from what I'll call the legacy or the traditional market. And how did they get their training? Well, they got it underground, and they learned on the job, and they learned by practicing and by making mistakes and by sharing knowledge with other people who were also in that same traditional market. So for them, the big challenge is to take what they know, which is quite valuable, but then also to put it into a regulated business kind of box. So they do have to follow, of course, all the compliance and all the rules, which is very different than what they were doing. So that's one of the biggest challenges for someone with knowledge, but maybe not all the regulatory knowledge. But then you also have people who just want to get into the business because they like the plant or they're interested. And for them, there are a few places where you can go get higher education. But short of that, you can also get certificates, and you can take online courses, sometimes in-person courses, often from continuing education departments or adult education departments. And that can be from a community college, it can be from a university, and they offer all kinds of classes. It can be a cultivation class, a medical cannabis class, compliance, introduction to the business. It just goes on and on and on. And then short of that, you have some people who are self-taught. So they will check out every book they can get their hands on. They will go to events. They'll go online and listen to webinars. They'll look at YouTube videos. So I would say those are the primary ways that people do get education to get in the business. There are a few people who start with almost no training, no education, and they get completely on the job training and education. And there are some employers who are willing to do that.
Today, already be in agriculture or retail or healthcare, what kind of advice would you give to someone to transition from one of those particular roles now to the cannabis sort of counterpart?
That is probably the question that I get asked the most. Because when I go to so many of the meet and greet events, I'll meet somebody and they have skills that they have developed in different areas. And their big question is, well, I know how to do X. I know how to do accounting, or I've been a business consultant and I write business plans. How do I convert that into cannabis? And one of the things that I do tell them is that in the upcoming book, Cannabis Careers, Insider's Guide to a Budding Industry, I devote a full chapter, chapter 4, to how to pivot your career. And essentially, what that does is I talk about how I think you need a baseline of cannabis knowledge, first of all.
Hmm.
You're not going to go far if you don't know things like basic terms and definitions. You need to know the history. You definitely need to know why it was prohibited in the U.S.
Hmm.
You need to know the effects that the prohibition and the war on drugs had on brown and black people and why we talk about social equity and why that is important in our industry. And then you need to know the regulations. So you have to buckle down and you have to read your state's 160 pages, 200 pages of regulations. Not necessarily the most pleasurable thing you might want to do, but you definitely have to know the regulations.
Hmm.
So you have to have the determination, you have to have the passion, baseline of knowledge. And then from there, you really have to look at yourself and figure out what skills do I have? And then now that I know a bit about cannabis, where do I fit in? And how can I tailor my resume, my cover letter to point out that the skills that I have here will in fact translate into cannabis?
Yeah. And how do the salary ranges sort of compare, right? So if you're in retail and you're working in at the Gap, and you want to transition and become a bud tender, what are the salary ranges like?
A lot of that depends on the exact position, but overall, there was some good data from Vangst, VANGST, and they are the largest job source in cannabis across the United States. So they list gigs, they list a bunch of jobs that are open, and every year they put out a jobs report along with Leafly. And essentially, the easiest way to say it is that the rates of pay will be at a minimum 5% higher and sometimes up to 20% higher. But again, that really depends on the job. And it does kind of go from, if you're looking at entry level, it is going to be about 5 or 10% more than a comparable job.
Huh?
But then if you look at something like a lead cultivator or somebody who's a COO, a CFO up at those levels, then you're looking more at the 20%. And sometimes it can even go higher than that. But the basic ballpark is between about 5 and 20%. And the percentage goes up as your skills and as the complexity of the job increases as well.
What are you seeing with regards to state and local workforce development agencies? Are they focused on this? Do they see this yet as a potential growth area?
It is really all over the map. So they do see it as a growth area. They do know it's a viable business, but at the same time, they often have difficulty figuring out exactly what to do. And so the most common thing I see is that some local governments will partner with either universities, often with unions,
Mhm.
and then they will be able to offer some workforce development. So they might do something like put together a cohort of 20 people that will go through a specific class that is funded. And at the end, they come out with a certification in cultivation or in business operations or something like that. And then they often have a partnership with dispensaries or with cultivators that will take the people that get through the class, or at least give them an interview with an idea of putting them into those jobs. So that's probably been the most successful model, is really look at partners. I've not seen any counties who have just done it on their own. They do, again, partner with universities and unions and then business people and try to develop a pipeline that way.
Now, you mentioned social equity, and what can cannabis companies do to promote social equity in their hiring practices?
Yeah, what first thing is, if they do understand the impacts that cannabis imprisonment has wrought on brown and black people, I think it will give them more of an opportunity to think about the reasons that they should hire people of color,
Mhm.
and that it's then that is imperative that they do. They also want them to look like their customers as well. So I think one thing that they can do is to try to certainly make sure that the mission of their company supports brown and black people, and then also provide training and partnerships in areas where they can start to recruit people of color to get in the industry as well. And then, of course, give them training when they're there, make them feel valued and heard so that they will stay on and continue to really excel in their jobs.
Now, as far as New York, let me just focus it on New York toward the end. What do you see like in the next 5 years as far as job growth? Are there particular regions of the state that you see as developing, faster than others?
I think it's interesting. If you look at a place like New York City,
Mhm.
it is so big and so broad that depending on how people can work out the zoning and not putting dispensaries too close to each other, there is still so much growth that can be had in New York City. So I think, and that almost feels like its own world, that you could just look at New York City as its own cannabis ecosphere. And I think that's where you're going to see a bunch of the job growth. But then I think other parts that are quite exciting is you have so much farmland in upstate, and you have some excellent farmers, cultivators. So I eventually think that I think we're going to see more greenhouses. We're going to see more outdoor grow, which is much more sustainable. You don't have to pay for the sun, and if you do pay for electricity indoors, that can be quite expensive. So I do think you're going to see a lot more cultivation. But then the one spot that I think is kind of a wild card is what I would call cannabis hospitality and tourism.
Right. Yeah, and I'm actually we're going to have an episode just focused on that, but please go ahead.
I mean, if you look at it, it has the potential to bring in billions and billions of dollars. People are looking for all kinds of experiences, and cannabis really works well with all kinds of things, whether it's wellness retreats and you're looking at things like CBD massages, whether it's tours. People love to go on tours. I can't tell you how excited they are to actually go to a field and see the plant and maybe even touch it, smell it, and go to a lab and see how product is made, tour a dispensary and see exactly how things work behind the scenes. So, and then there's also things like cooking with cannabis and infused dinners. There's things like concerts where people can partake. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And I think you're just limited by your creativity once you look at the area of hospitality and tourism.
Right, and again, I'm concerned that there doesn't appear to be like a real focus on this yet in New York State and New York City in particular, but hopefully that'll be coming relatively soon. Any words to New York City government, to New York State government, on what they can do to better promote, the overall growth of the cannabis industry?
I think one thing that they'll want to look at is what's happening in New Jersey with our consumption lounges. Consumption lounges are an interesting animal. There are a few of those that are in California. There's a handful in Nevada, but New Jersey will be starting ours probably as early as this summer. And essentially what that will do is give people a safe place to gather and to partake in cannabis. It also will help with tourists quite a bit too, because what happens is if you're a tourist and you come into a dispensary in a different state, you can get your product. And let's say that you do want to inhale, you want to smoke something. You can't do it at your hotel generally. You can't do it in any kind of federal housing. You can't be on a college campus. It can't be on a street, on a beach. The short answer is the only place you can do it is in a private home, a private home where somebody says you can. So now if you have a lounge, you can actually go to a dispensary and then you can partake there. And I think that will really move the experience and get some people hopefully out of the casinos in Atlantic City, for example, and get them into the dispensaries for a while. But New York being such a wonderful place to visit and to experience restaurants and museums and the High Line Trail and concerts and everything else, you are so set up to make consumption lounges a safe and really vibrant place for people to visit. So I would say take a look at that. And then the other thing I was glad to see is that New York State...
New York does have the indoor consumption in its statute. The agency is still working on regulations.
Yes, and I've been to a few of the underground establishments.
Absolutely.
And and I do think that if the regulated establishments look like that, they will be successful. Because people do have good experiences there, and it is safe, and it's a place where people can gather and talk, and they feel welcome.
Which again is another area of concern that it's happening already anyway. So the agency really needs to focus on this.
Yeah, that is true.
All right. So where can folks hear more about the work that you're doing? Where can they find the book when it's released?
So the book will be on Amazon.com. It will be in a bunch of bookstores. It will certainly be in libraries, on college campuses. I'll try to get it into dispensaries. Okay. So hopefully you can actually get it there as well. But online definitely will be an easy place to get that. And then I am quite active on LinkedIn. So on LinkedIn, I do post a lot of activities that I'm involved in, either where I'm going to be speaking or what our cannabis club is doing, and the public is always invited. We do all kinds of free events. We do film festivals, we do art shows, we do yoga. I did a cooking with cannabis demonstration. we have a lot of things going on. So we do invite the public to come and support students. So if you believe in cannabis education, in higher education, and you want a workforce that is trained and knowledgeable, we're hoping you'll come out and talk to the students and help them. You can mentor them, you can give them advice, you can give them leads, or you can just find out what they're interested in.
And where in New Jersey is Stockton University?
It is we have a Galloway campus, which is exit 44 off the Parkway, and then also we have an Atlantic City campus. Most of our activity goes on at our Galloway campus.
Terrific. Thank you, Professor Mejia. Thank you for your time today and these words of wisdom. Thank you very much. Happy
to be here. Thank you so much for the time.
That's it for this episode of Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. If you found today's discussion valuable, consider leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more listeners find the show. Better yet, share it with colleagues, advocates, and anyone interested in the future of cannabis in New York. Joint Session is produced by me, Herb Barbot, together with executive producer Robert Curtis from Simlev Media. Special thanks, as always, to Cannabis Wire. You can follow us on Instagram at jointsession.pod and on LinkedIn at Joint Session Podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions, reach out to me at herb.jointsession@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Herb Barbot. Thanks for listening.